The number one reason why lifters plateau is that they don't know how to balance stimulus they're creating with training with fatigue costs that it accrues. Any coach can tell you to train harder to drive more stimulus to break your plateau. And any coach can tell you stop training so hard if you feel fatigued. But you might not create enough stimulus in order to actually progress, or you might create too much fatigue to recover from. Finding the way to balance these two things is the key to breaking plateaus. Before you waste the next hour of your life listening to me talk, let me give you a few reasons why I'm trustworthy. I've been training for over 10 years, competing in powerlifting for over 8 years, having done over 15 competitions. I've been coaching for the last 6 years, working with over 300 lifters. I run a mentorship for other coaches to help them level up their skills, and I run a team of 5 assistant coaches, working with over 100 total athletes. I have personally achieved a 1752 competition total, 1836 training total, 529 competition dots. I've coached over 10 national champions, including this last weekend, Hassan Coleman, who won the 66 kg junior class at Powerlifting America Nationals. I've also coached lifters like Andy, who has won a USAPL Pro card, placed top 3 at the Arnold, as well as lifters like Sawyer, who are nearly squatting and deadlifting over 800 pounds with a 530 plus dots again, and many other accomplishments that I and my lifters have achieved that I'm not going to bother naming. But none of these big lifts have come without having to face plateaus along the way. And whether the athlete has been very locked in on their variables and recovery like Andy, or not so locked in like Hassan, it still comes down to the same two issues. How much stimulus can we drive, and how much fatigue can we recover from? Every time we've overcome a plateau, it's from fixing those two things. By the end of this video, regardless of your recovery capacity, you should have the tools to break your plateau. The exception being technique-based issues. If your technique sucks, this video is on the programming side, not the technique side. You'll have to wait till I drop some more videos on technique before I can help with that. I've got 6 things I'm going to be breaking down in this video for how to actually manage fatigue. We've got the peak intensity, or the intensity of the SBD that we're doing. We have the SBD volume. We have our technique, which is very underrated in how this actually impacts your fatigue. We have long-term macro cycle planning, our accessories, and our split design to make sure that our lifts aren't bleeding over into each other, like our squat nuking our deadlift and vice versa. And when it comes to SBD intensity, there's 3 main categories I'm going to cover, which are going to be our primary top sets and how we pace those across our block, our secondary days pacing, and the rep ranges that we're primarily running on most of our back downs, but also on top sets too. For our primary top set pacing, the way that we ramp up across the weeks, the most important thing is not to blow your load early. Many lifters who are running the 4-week cycle are going to feel really strong on week 3, which might lead to them taking a weight that's just inappropriate. The program might say RP8, and they may even hit RP8, but if the next week's supposed to be RP9, it might be heavy enough crossing that threshold at which it tanks their strength for the following week because they blew their load early. And another common mistake is not pulling back far enough on your first week of the block to actually clear the fatigue you created from the previous block. A general framework that I like to use for pacing yourself across a 4-week block, but this does work for any block from 3 weeks all the way up to 6, or more really if you wanted to, is week 1 should be easy enough that we're able to recover from the fatigue we produced during the previous block. Week 4, obviously, is where we're hoping to hit some PRs. Week 3 is our alley-oop week, where we're setting ourselves up to feel as strong as possible the following week. And then everything that's in between, so our week 2, or if you're running a 5-week block, there's going to be your week 2 and your week 3. These are just to bridge the gap between that week 1 and that week 3. That week 3, we need to be careful not to cross that threshold at which performance drops. And the reason why this is the most important for squat and deadlift is because we're usually doing fewer back down sets on those lifts, which means our top sets make up a larger percentage of the total work that we're doing within the week. And if we overdo that, it has a greater cost. An additional point I forgot to mention in that is also the axial fatigue associated with squats and deadlifts. The extra compression on our spine just produces a little bit more systemic fatigue. Plus, we're just using more muscles in general. Lifting a heavier absolute load is also going to cost us more. But the axial fatigue of lifting a heavier load, in addition to what I was talking about with the top sets being a larger portion of your workload. Whereas with bench, when we're doing more back down volume, which we'll get into next with the SBD volumes, the back down intensity is usually more of a lever, and bench can typically handle higher absolute intensities. And when I'm talking about intensity here, I'm primarily speaking of the RP at which you're pushing. The best mindset that you should go into your blocks with is having an idea of where you want to end, and rather than each week seeing where you land and seeing where you end, you pick that end goal and you work your way backwards to figure out where you need to start, and you take logical steps to end there. The stronger you are, the lighter you're going to need to start this top set. Generally, I start my lifters who are pretty strong around RP 5, and then we'll go 6, and then we'll go 7, and then we'll jump up to RP 9. And if you're not quite as strong, generally below about a 400 dots, you can start at 6, 7, 8, 9 and do a more linear progression there. But for strong lifters, you're usually going to have to take a bigger jump from that week 3 up to that week 4 load, because there's so much more cost just for lifting a heavier absolute load. And if I were to give you some rough percentages for you stronger lifters, I would start your block at about 80% of your goal. Then we're going to jump to 85 to 90, and then we'll jump up to our goal. If you're not quite as strong, This might be more of an 85, 90, 95, 100. Another thing you'll want to take into account here too is your individual leverages. The more well-built you are for a lift, generally the lower the fatigue cost of pushing those higher RPs, and you can get away with taking smaller weekly jumps. The worse you built for a lift, the bigger jumps you're going to need to take, so that way you're actually starting your block lighter. There's a lot of things that go into this, but the reason why most of my lifters are PRing on their very first block on the team is because I know how to dial this in exactly for the individual, and I actually whip together a calculator. If you check the caption, I have a calculator that will help you pace your top sets for your block. And it's going to take into account how strong you are, what your body weight is, where or how hard you're pushing the end of the block, how your leverages are for each lift. So check it out. Next is going to be our pacing for our secondary days, and this is a lot more individual. It's going to take some more playing around to figure out exactly where this should be, and generally the window in which you're operating in terms of pulling back on week 1 and pushing really high on week 4 is going to be titrated in a little bit more. So for example, if we're working from RPE 5 all the way up to RPE 9 on the primary, we may be working from 6 up to RPE 8 on the secondary. The reason for that is our secondaries are intended to set us up for the primary to feel strong on that day. And if the stimulus we're doing on this day is wildly inconsistent, then how we feel coming into the primary on the next week is also going to be inconsistent. You still want progression here, and depending on the lifter, you may be able to push this harder at the end of your block. Usually the stronger you are, the bigger you are, the longer your range of motion, the worse your leverage is, the lighter you're going to have to go on this day. And the rep counts that you're running on this day is also going to be individual, which ties into my last point. When it comes to identifying your ideal rep counts, running a more traditional linear periodized program where you're starting with higher reps and you're working your way to lower reps is actually a really good way to find out what your ideal rep range is. Typically, if you were to break it into a 12-week structure, you would find that during one of those segments of the 12 weeks, there was a rep range where you were progressing better in. That's the rep range that you should spend the majority of your time in. So for example, let's say during the middle of the program when you were running a lot of sets of 4 to 6, you were progressing great. Rather than going 8, 10, 6, 4, 2, you're just going to go 6, 5, 4, and you're going to stay in a smaller range of your rep work on this secondary day. Another useful thing that you can look at is what sort of rep ranges do you actually have the highest estimated 1 rep max. So if you're really good at sets of 10 and you suck at singles, you probably shouldn't be doing a lot of singles on this day because it means you're creating an ineffective stimulus. And you can drive great stimulus with those sets of 10. Now, for most powerlifters, we're not going to be running sets of 10. In the way that I program, it's typically going to be more like somewhere between 4 to 7 reps on this day. We're going to bias towards where you're the strongest at there and what actually leaves you feeling strongest on this day. A couple other things to consider too is if you keep coming into your primary day and the bar on squat either feels really heavy on your back or really heavy in your hands on bench, you probably need to touch a heavier load on this day to feel more prepared for this one. There's a couple different ways that this can look. You could do a variation that's heavier. So let's say you were running front squats on your secondary day, and then you come into your primary day and your back squats feel heavy. You could just swap those front squats to a high bar, or if you're running high bar, maybe you swap your top set to a low bar, and then you continue to run the variation that's useful for you on that secondary day. But the main point is, if the bar feels really heavy on this primary, we've got to touch something heavier on the secondary, and rep ranges are a tool that we can use to control that. So this also might mean we shift from taking top sets of 6 then to top sets of 3 or 4 on this secondary day, and that top set allows us to feel the load, and then our back downs, we stick with the rep range that we feel strongest in and that we progress the most with. And these back down rep ranges can also stay the exact same for multiple months on end. The most important thing is that you're actually able to consistently progress them. If you've gotten more advanced, it can be pretty rough trying to progress the exact same rep range for more than about 8 weeks or 2 blocks, depending on the length of your block. That's when titrating those reps down can be a useful way to continue adding load to the bar. So an example of this might look like, let's say you're better at higher reps and they tend to drive up your strength better. For the first 2 blocks, we're running back down sets of 7. And for the next 2 blocks, we're running back down sets of 6. And then we can reset back to those 7s. And when I say you're progressing for 8 weeks, that doesn't mean every week we're going heavier. It means we're starting, let's say at 300, 310, 320, 330. We reset back to like 305, then 315, 325, 335. Another sign that you may want to stick to the higher end of the rep range is that you come into your primary session and you feel like it's very difficult to connect to the actual muscles that are being used. The muscles might feel flat, like you don't have much of a pump, and like you're lacking pop in the muscles. If that's the case, then running higher reps is going to drive more blood flow into the muscles. It's going to lead to more inflammation and more edema or swelling coming into the next session, which will leave the muscle feeling fuller, and you'll have a better mind-muscle connection with it and usually have an easier time feeling that muscle working. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, some lifters may come into their session and they can connect with the muscle really well. They can feel it working. They got great blood flow last session, but it ends up leading to a feeling like your legs are just heavy and dead, or like, yes, you can connect with your pecs well, it feels full, but it feels dead. That's a sign that you need to back off of your reps because the fatigue is actually a net negative for you. There's more considerations in terms of how much your form breaks down and things like that that we're also going to dive into with some of the other sections. Before I move on to the next section, I did want to give you guys a couple of examples. So if you're a rep monster, somebody who does really good with higher reps, it might look something like this with a 1x3 and a 2x6 on your primary, and a 1x6 and a 2x7 on your secondary. This is typically what a higher end of the rep range is going to look like in a program that I would write. And then if you're an intensity king and you tend to respond better to the lower rep counts, it might look something like a 1x1 with a 3x3 in your primary and a 1x3 and a 3x4 on your secondary. And if this is bench, you're usually going to have multiple secondaries within the week. And if you're recovery Chad, your RP progression across the block, at least for your top sets, might look like at 6, 7, 8, 9 on your primary, 7, 7.5, 8, 9 on your secondary. Notice how, like I mentioned, the secondary is often going to titrate in a smaller window. And so he's ranging from 7 to 9 here. And the primaries is a more aggressive ramp up across the block, with both ending at 9, pushing for really big sets multiple times within the same week. Some lifters can recover from this. Usually this is going to be smaller, more lightweight, newer lifters who are weaker. And one thing which I will touch on in the technique section, but to be mindful of, is if your technique breaks down a lot under high exertions, you're going to have to be more careful about doing this, even if you do recover well from it. You don't want to practice bad habits. And then next is a sensitive Sally, which sounds like a bad thing, but in reality, if you're a stronger lifter like I am, you're probably going to be a sensitive Sally. Also, the taller you are, the heavier you are, the longer you've been training, the more you transition from this recovery Chad into this sensitive Sally, where you have to be really careful about how hard you're pushing your SBD. So an example of an RP progression for somebody like that might mean their primary starts at 5, 6, 7, and then we jump to RP 9. So all of our week 1 through 3 is 1 RP less than the recovery Chad here. And then our secondary might go 5, 5.5, 6, 7, which is 2 RP points lower than the recovery Chad. And these are two ends of the extreme. I'm not saying pick this or pick this. You may fall somewhere in between the two. Maybe you have to start at RP 5.5, not at 5, not at 6. And maybe your secondary, I've done this plenty of times and have for many lifters, where it will follow the same RP progression as the primary, where we go 5, 6, 7, 9. If you're getting a lot of volume from your accessories, it's more likely that you can take this drastic approach in terms of your RPE, because your accessories are keeping that stimulus more static, and the changes we make to our SBD are less of a drastic change because we're just doing less of it. And like I mentioned, I really do not want this point to slip by unnoticed. Oftentimes, you should ignore your RPE and instead take the load that makes the most sense for ending at your end of block goal. Use your RPE to adjust up or down a little bit based on the load that makes sense. Let's say you wanted to go 355, 375, 395, 420, and on that 375 week, you feel really good. That doesn't mean you send it all the way up to that 395 that you wanted to take next week. That means maybe you take 385, and if you don't feel as good, maybe you take 365. This ensures that we're still getting a load progression every single week of the block. So there's some minor considerations for the RPE, but it's really not around hitting the exact RPE. It's more so having your planned load and just titrating up or down based on how you feel that day, with next week's planned load and last week's load that you actually hit being your upper and lower bounds to ensure you still have room to progress load every week. And like I said, in case you missed it, in the caption or the description of this, I have a free calculator to figure out your ideal pacing that you can then adjust based on how you're feeling for the day, up or down a little bit. Next, we're gonna be diving into SBD volume, which is primarily based around the back down work that we're doing. We're not so much touching the top sets, nor are we really diving into primary versus secondary. This is looking at the individual session. The first is gonna be the back down set number. A lot of people who are used to training really hard have the wrong approach to their SBD volume. They view it as a tool for adding size and stimulating hypertrophy, when in reality, the stronger we get, the less effective SBD becomes for adding size, and the more we have to use it just for improving our skill. This means we're gonna have to train at a lower average RPE in order to squeeze in more sets and continue to improve that skill. This is often one of the hardest things to get through the head of a new lifter who comes from a more bodybuilding, bro style background. They love to train hard, and it's hard to believe that when you back off to RPE 5, it's actually going to blow up your strength. Generally, the more technical your lift is, the more sets you're going to need in order to keep that technique sharp and continue to improve it. If you're not a very technical lifter, you bench with a flat back, close grip, long range of motion, you could probably get away with doing less sets. If you're a conventional puller, you can get away with doing less sets. But if you're a really wide stance sumo puller who's super efficient And being out of position the tiniest bit is often the difference between completing your third attempt and failing it. You're going to need more sets to refine that skill, which means you're going to have to bias more towards your sets being focused on skill practice than on adding size in order to recover from those greater total set counts you're performing. If I were to give a range of how many sets within a single session somebody might do, the bare minimum is probably going to be 3 in most cases. If you can't recover from 3 sets, you need to do the sets easier. And the high end is going to be up to 6 sets. If you think you need more than 6 sets in a single day, then you should probably just increase your training frequency. The one exception to that would be if the sets are focused primarily on force production or speed, explosiveness, power, whatever you want to call it, and they've got an extremely low RPE, you can get away with doing more sets because they're so easy. Which plays into my next point, which is bar speed. Powerlifting is a sport that revolves around producing as much force as possible and putting it into the weight. Force equals mass times acceleration, which means if we are lifting a lighter weight faster, we are training the skill of producing more force. This isn't quite as specific because we have to be able to produce that force at a slow speed, but it does still have carryover. And if we take, let's say, 75% of your max and we hit it for a set of 10, the amount of force that we're producing on that first rep is going to be much higher than the force we produce on the last rep because we've fatigued and the bar speed is slowed down. Same amount of mass, less acceleration means you're producing less force. Now the downside of those more submaximal sets is we get a less complete stimulus. When we push that set all the way to failure, we get those high force production reps at the beginning of the set. We also develop more of that slow strength that's necessary to actually grind through a max, which is a skill in and of itself. And in addition to that, we're also going to create somewhat of a hypertrophy stimulus, especially if you're newer to the sport. SBD is going to be more effective at actually stimulating hypertrophy if you haven't fully filled out your frame yet. And therefore, pushing those sets harder can be an effective way to just build every quality necessary for actually getting stronger, assuming your technique's good, which I will dive into as the next point. And if you remember back on the last section for SBD intensity and dialing in your optimal rep range, I was mentioning how some lifters benefit from having more fullness within the muscle. If you were to do, let's say, 70% of your max on your back down, but you were only doing it for sets of 3, you would have a lot of force being put into the bar. You could recover from doing a lot of sets, and your total volume might be, let's say, 25 reps, or for the sake of math, let's say 24 reps, so call it a 6x4. But because your sets are so far from failure, we're not actually driving much blood flow into the muscles, and we're not going to get that feeling of fullness coming into the next session, at least not from that. The accessories can cover that box though. But if you're a lifter who needs more of that fullness, then switching that 6x4 into a 3x8, let's say, your sets are much harder and you're going to drive more blood flow into the legs and you're going to get more fullness coming into the next session, which as we mentioned, some lifters benefit from that, some lifters don't. You're going to want to try and dial in how much does that feeling of fullness within your muscles help or hurt you. And the other thing when you consider is, can you actually recover from it? For myself, on my bench in particular, it's very technical. I have a high arch, I use a wide grip, a lot of leg drive, a very soft touch. I can push the sets. My technique stays consistent. My bar speed doesn't even drop off that much actually from rep to rep. So I've got decent force production too, but at the end of the day, my pec tendons just struggle to recover from pushing so many sets. I bench 18 sets a week, so trying to push all of those beats me up pretty quick, which also relates to another point. When it comes to picking the RP and how hard you're pushing your back downs, I actually find that on bench, if you're running into fatigue management issues where you're getting too beat up, like I mentioned I was, the back downs are more often the culprit because you're doing more back downs. Every slight increase in RPE, myself, for example, I do 15 back down sets a week. If I up to RPE by 1, that's a cumulative total of 15 extra RPEs. But if you're somebody who squats, let's say 7 sets a week, and you've got 5 back downs and you add 1 RPE to those, you've only added 5 additional RPE, so to speak. So it just accumulates way faster on the lifts where you're doing more volume if you try to increase the RP on those. And so if bench is running into fatigue management issues, the RP on the back downs is the first place I'm going to look. And like I mentioned in the SBD intensity section, if squat and deadlift are running into fatigue issues, the top sets is usually the first place I'm going to look. Lastly, we have variations. Some variations are going to require more cueing to execute them. For example, a tempo squat, a pause deadlift, a long pause bench, a pause squat. Generally things where we're changing the tempo and we're adding in pauses are things where it takes more mental effort in order to execute on those. If you're a lifter who comes into your sessions exhausted from a long day of doing manual labor or just a stressful job, it's going to be harder to actually execute on those because your mind is so fatigued. And one way that we can work around that is by choosing variations that make the issues we're trying to fix mindless, which, to rewind a little bit, you should be choosing your variations that correct bad habits that you have or that allow you to recover from more volume. Now, I do prefer variations when possible where it does require the lifter to think a little bit more. They tend to be more specific, and if they can execute on them well, they have a little bit more carryover. For example, pause squats can be great, but if a lifter continuously rushes their pauses, I might give them a pin squat to force them to actually pause at the bottom. Another good example is if a lifter keeps shooting their hips back, it's not really a variation to tell them stop doing that, but we can give them something like a high bar squat or a safety bar squat that's going to punish them more for shooting their hips back and encourage the habits that we're trying to reinforce. And then the last thing we should consider with variations is how it changes where the stress is occurring on the body. For example, if your hips and low back get really beat up from a lot of squatting volume, something like a high bar is going to help save those while you still get to push the quads a lot harder with a very specific stimulus that's probably still going to have carryover in terms of improving the scale practice of your SBD. If your shoulders get really beat up because you've got a long range of motion on bench, doing something like a block press might be a good way to reduce your range of motion, save your shoulders, let you get close to the same stimulus, and push the triceps a little bit harder. I'll make sure to link below some of the posts I have that it can help you pick what variations might be good for you. I wanted to give you guys an example of two extremes. My bench is incredibly technical, and I can maintain technique really well across a lot of sets even as I fatigue. So I've got 18 sets over the course of the week for my bench. I do a 3-count pause single. I've chosen a 3-count pause because it reinforces me staying tight at the bottom of the bench, and the bottom of the bench is the hardest part. Spend more time down there, you're gonna feel more comfortable. And I do this heavy 3-count pause, like I mentioned in the last video. Sometimes if your primary feels heavy in your hands, touching something heavier this session before, especially on that top set, helps the primary not feel so heavy. So I take a 3-count pause single before my primary session. And then for my back downs, I've got the competition movement for 5 sets of 4. Again, I mentioned earlier as well that 6 sets per session is generally my upper limit. All 3 of my sessions are riding that upper edge of 6 sets because I need a lot of work to really keep the skill of my bench press honed. Next, I have my primary day. I take a single, and then depending on what phase of training I'm in, somewhere between 3 to 5 reps. There's nothing special about this, just some classic heavy work. But then I move into some medium grip, where I bring my grip within 2 fingers, and I'm actually arching less as well in order to intentionally try and increase my range of motion. And I'm running this for a slightly higher rep count of 5 to 7. Again, depending on the block that I'm in. And the reason why I'm running slightly higher rep counts here with the bigger range of motion is because my range of motion is so small. I want to create more overall stimulus for my bench that the competition movement just doesn't offer. And the reason why I placed it on my primary day after the primary is because if I were to try and do that the session before my primary, for example, I wouldn't have enough recent technical practice to feel prepared for this day. But now that I've got my primary out of the way, I can move on to my least specific bench work in the entire week, and I can take advantage of that stimulus without the lack of technical practice bleeding over into any important sessions. And because my technique's not as primed on this day, because I've only done 2 competition sets, it flows into my least important, lightest day of the week, which is my spot press day, where I come down to about 1 inch off the chest. Because I just did this session with the increased range of motion, sometimes my pecs and shoulders can be a little bit more beat up, so that spot press helps reduce the range of motion slightly. If you're a soft touch bencher, spot press can also help reinforce not accidentally sinking and making sure you're maintaining really good control of that weight, because you're not stopping the weight with the bar sinking into you at all. You're stopping it 100% with your pecs. If you have shoulder issues, spot press can help, but if you have pec issues, sometimes spot press can make it a little bit worse because it ensures the pec is actually what's stopping the weight, not your body mass. And then I've got my competition 5x5. This is slightly higher rep than this 5x4 because I don't need as much preparation of touching heavy loads coming into this session. So this is just a slightly less specific day than this day, but still a decent bit of skill practice. 5 sets with the competition grip, or with the exact competition movement, 6 sets with the competition grip, but a slightly different range of motion. This day, the full range of motion, all of the exact same positions as this day, but I'm just doing a long pause for one of the sets. So that's my bench, where it's highly technical and I need that skill to be honed, and I need to feel heavy loads going into my primary. And because I've got the long range of motion, a variation that intentionally increases my range of motion. Next, we've got my squat setup, which is almost the exact opposite. I actually only squat once a week because squatting beats me up so much, and my squat is not very technical, which means I don't need to do very much of it in order to feel well. So depending on the phase of training I'm in, I'll hit a top set of 1 to 3, I'll hit another set of 4 to 6, and also depending on the phase of training I'm in, which we'll get into in the macro cycle planning section, I might push this set harder or I might push this set harder. And then I move into 2 sets of high bar, which are higher reps, sets of 6 to 8. For myself, one of the most important things for my squat to feel strong is that I can feel my quads working really well under me, and I've got to get a lot of blood flow and a lot of good reps in an upright position in order to improve that skill, which I suck at on my competition movement. So by moving into high bar, I'm training in a more upright pattern, and by doing a higher rep, I'm getting more blood flow into my quads. Another thing to note is that I fatigue really fast when I squat, not necessarily from rep to rep, but from set to set. After 2 sets of low bar, I am not going to be able to execute on any sort of high quality low bar work, but I can execute on high quality high bar work. So in order to get close to the same skill as low bar, I move on to high bar, and it's actually probably gonna have more technique carryover for me than just doing more low bar sets because my form is gonna be so ass after those 2 sets. And one thing that I have been messing around with lately is on my deadlift day, I actually work up to like 60% on squat for 1 set of 3, just to practice that groove a little bit and get in those positions, because my hips have been a little bit tight coming into this session without getting in that position multiple times within the week. And then another thing to note too is that my competition squat beats up my hips quite a bit, or at least the musculature around my hips, my glutes, and my adductors. And so by moving on to high bar, it also helps save my glutes and adductor recovery for my deadlift session later in the week, which will come into account with the split section of the video. Something that I didn't touch on in this video is recovery. One of the most important aspects of recovery is stress management. And this guy likes to stress me out by eating the notes I make for these videos. And if you can just lay around like this in the sun, it's a great method for de-stressing and improving your recovery. The next thing that we're going to be looking at is form and how your form changes the stimulus that's occurring on the body. Now, the 3 main things here are going to be form breakdown across sets and reps, asymmetry on your reps, and range of motion and extreme positions that different techniques are going to put you in. Now, if we start with form breakdown, in an ideal world, when we squat, we're going to have an even distribution between work on the quads and the hips. This red line represents the center of mass of the whole system of you and the weight, which should be over midfoot underneath the barbell. And then we've got a guy squatting here, and this green line is the length of the lever arm. The length of the lever arm on each joint determines how hard that joint is actually being stressed and the muscles responsible for training it. So the farther the knees are forward, the longer the lever arm we're going to have on the quads, and the more that the quads will be receiving a stimulus, and the less that the hips will be receiving a stimulus. Now, if you're a lifter like me, and the more fatigued you get, the more that your hips start to shoot back, then that stimulus is going to get a smaller lever arm on the knees to the point where there's almost none, and a much longer lever arm on the hips and on the low back. So if I push my sets hard, my form breaks down and looks like this, and end up creating a different stimulus that I'm actually trying to create here. The stimulus becomes closer to a good morning than to a squat pattern. And especially if I want to grow my quads, which are my weak point, and they are the limiting factor in my squat, pushing hard sets that allow form breakdown like this are actually just building up my strengths and neglecting my weaknesses even further, making the habit worse over time. So if you have a lot of form breakdown when you lift, it's best to keep your sets a little bit easier and stick to things where you have less form breakdown. This might mean you can't do high reps if on high reps your form breaks down more, or it might mean you can't go low reps. Maybe your form breaks down more under absolute loading, or it might mean that just simply pushing a set to a high RPE is where your form breaks down. You're gonna have to assess that for yourself, but you should do most of your work with sets that don't have very much form breakdown, so you start reinforcing the good habits and you improve your skill of maintaining position and stimulating the right muscles. This is also gonna make your training more predictable if the stimulus you're creating is consistent and not switching. I can try and count how much quad volume I'm doing from my squatting, but if when I squat, my position changes, I'm not actually getting quad stimulus anymore. And if I'm progressing my RP too aggressively across the weeks to the point where my technique begins to change, I'm also not only getting more stimulus and more fatigue, where that fatigue actually accrues changes from being in my quads more to in my hips and my low back. Next, if we look at asymmetries, we've got another force vector here. The center of mass of the barbell is obviously in line with the middle of the barbell, but this green line is going to be the moment arm from this left leg versus this right leg. And obviously, if you're shifting into that left leg has to work harder because this moment arm is longer than on that side. Now, asymmetries aren't inherently bad. The human body is actually inherently asymmetrical. We have different sized lungs. Our organs are located differently inside of our body. The diaphragm, which is one of the muscles we use for bracing, is asymmetrical, which leads to our ribs being asymmetrical, the way that we brace asymmetrically, and that's going to affect all sorts of things around. So some degree of asymmetry is normal. However, if you begin experiencing pain on one side of the body and you check and you're using a hip shift, or the bar is uneven when you're benching or uneven on your back when you're squatting, then chances are improving that asymmetry will help to reduce the amount of pain you're having on the one side. If it's pain on both sides, changing your asymmetries is probably not what's going to clear that up. It's just a load management issue. Another decent rule of thumb too is if this pain is flaring up, but it's only after your heaviest lifts, a big week 4, and it's always followed by a deload afterwards anyways, that you always recover from in time to get ready for that next block anyways, it's probably not a huge concern either. When we push our body to its absolute limits, especially as we get stronger, it's going to push back a little bit, and it's not necessarily worth trying to fix the asymmetry at the cost of less effective training. But when the pain is actually inhibiting our productive training, that's when we really want to address it. And then the last time when it's probably worth addressing is if you are failing consistently on one side. This most often looks like when we're benching, one arm struggles to lock out. If we're lifting asymmetrically, improving that is also probably going to be worthwhile. Asymmetry can be a result of mobility imbalances, coordination issues, or muscle size differences. That's going to take some individual testing in order to figure out what that is. And it's a whole other concept, and it's really dependent on the joint and everything else like that for me to be able to try and explain to you how to actually fix asymmetries. Last thing we have is range of motion. Whether your range of motion is really extreme or we're biasing ourselves into really extreme positions, not necessarily a really long range of motion, both of these are going to change how fatigue is accumulating across the body. If you have a really long range of motion, because work, I believe, is force times distance, maybe it's power times distance, I think it's power times distance. The longer the distance is that we're traveling with the load, the more amount of work that we're putting on our body and the more stress the responsible muscles and joints are going to become from it. So if you have really short arms, deadlifting means you're going to have a longer range of motion, you're performing more work per rep, and you're more likely to get beat up from pushing those sets as well. If you have a really small arch, you bench with a close grip, or you've got really long arms, then you're going to have a big range of motion when you bench. That's also probably going to beat you up more. You're more likely to have some shoulder issues flare up from things like that as well. And lastly, when you're squatting, if you've got really short femurs and you have a long torso, you're going to be really upright when you squat. It's not very difficult. But in the opposite case, if you've got long femurs and a short torso, when you squat, you're going to get really bent over, which isn't necessarily a significant increase in your range of motion, but it does put you in a more extreme joint angle with a much longer lever arm and total stretch on the hip complex rather than on the knees. If you're a lifter who has a really long range of motion, you're probably going to want to run on average lower reps, although this is a little bit more individual, and you're typically going to have to keep your RPEs more in check because it's going to be harder to maintain your technique consistently without having form breakdown as the sets go on. This is where tools, like I mentioned, running high bar for myself on squat are really useful, or running a board press might be useful for somebody to reduce their range of motion if the shoulders are getting beat up. And if your joints aren't necessarily getting beat up, but you're just getting out of position, you can refer back to this form breakdown section where we're just going to keep our RPEs lower in order to not practice those bad habits. And if you still really need to refine that skill, you can't afford to push your sets harder, that's when doing more sets comes into play, which kind of goes back to what I was talking about with my bench. When I try to push my bench sets hard, I actually don't have an extreme range of motion, but it does beat up my pecs a lot, so I do more sets. But that just depends how much practice you actually need to feel ready. The next thing I want to touch on is using extreme techniques in order to reduce our range of motion often leads to certain joints being extra stressed. This usually means when we go really wide, whether it's a wide grip bench or a really wide stance squat like I have drawn out here, it's going to change the lever arms. Most people know if we squat really narrow, we're going to be driving the knees more forward and we're going to hit the quads really hard. It's going to look more like this picture. But if we squat really wide, we're going to have a really long moment arm from the center of the system towards our hips, which is going to put a lot of extra strain, especially on the adductors. And this is part of why I run into some pec recovery issues when I try to push my bench work, because I'm so wide, I'm pretty much all chest when I bench, and my chest is by far the thing that gets the most beat up. I've never had elbow issues when benching before because I'm so chest dominant in the way that I do it, which also means on my accessories, I have to do very little chest work because I need a lot of bench volume to have my technique feel good. And the volume that I'm doing is very chest heavy. My pecs get a ton of stimulus from bench and they can't recover from much additional stimulus from the accessories. But if you're a more narrow stance squatter like this, for example, with a very short lever arm on the hips, you're probably going to have to make sure you're doing some accessories for the hips in order to make sure they're not completely neglected, but you're also at a lower risk of the hips getting overworked on your squat work. If that extreme range of motion tends to beat up your joints, especially because maybe you have a long range of motion on bench, you find it really difficult to stay tight, your shoulders tend to bunch forward, you're probably more likely to get injured from that changing position under load. That's where accessories are really useful for filling in the gap. And that's the exact system that I use on my squats. I do very little squatting work, and I do a lot of accessories to make up for the lack of stimulus that I'm producing there. Because if I tried to just do a ton of squatting, like I've mentioned my former breakdown a ton, I would probably be more likely to get hurt and I wouldn't be creating an effective stimulus. So I do the bare minimum amount of squatting and then I use my accessories to fill the gaps. Next we have split design. Where we place things in the week is going to affect how they show up and how well we can perform. The three main things that I take into consideration are the timing and how far spaced apart these things are, the bleed over of a squat and a deadlift, deadlift into squat, and for some lifters, squat into bench press, and then in real life circumstances such as life stress, and balancing that with the predictability of making sure we can perform on meet day. When it comes to timing your training and how far apart we space different sessions for the same exercise, some lifters are going to benefit more from being more well rested and recovered going into a session, while other lifters are going to benefit from having trained very recently and having that fresh skill practice and a fresh stimulus to make sure they show up with high degrees of fitness on competition day or high degrees of fitness on their primary session. For squat and deadlift, this usually means you're going to do them each twice a week, and from one session to another, you'll have 2 rest days, and from one session to another, you'll have 3 rest days. In general, I usually start with lifters pushing both sessions roughly equally as hard, and whichever session ends up showing up as the more consistently strong day is the session that we're going to place the primary on. If you find you show up for your session and you feel really fresh, well recovered, but your technique feels rusty, the bar feels really heavy on your back, or your muscles feel really flat and you struggle to actually use the right muscles you want to recruit, you probably are a lifter who's going to benefit from a little bit less time in between sessions. If you're a super technical lifter like myself on bench press, you're also probably going to benefit from less time in between sessions. If you're a lifter with a really long range of motion who's not super technical, such as a conventional deadlift, which is just very muscularly driven, there's not a ton of finesse when it comes to the positioning, then you're probably somebody who's going to benefit a little bit more from the recovery side. Now that gives you a good starting point, but at the end of the day, you've got to individualize it to yourself and see how your body responds to these different rest periods. When it comes to bench, most lifters are either going to do it 3 days a week or 4 days a week. On a 3-day setup, you're going to have 2 sessions with 1 day of rest in between and 1 session with 2 days of rest in between. If you recall back to when I was laying out my bench setup, I benched 3 days a week, and because I'm so technical and I need to feel some heavy load in my hands, that 3 count pause day with my heaviest back downs has 1 day of rest before I come into my primary. I previously have done it with 2 days of rest to feel more well recovered. My technique ends up feeling a little bit rusty and out of the groove. Now, another option that I could have put in there would be stick with that 3 count pause day and then 2 days in between before I come back to my competition lift day. And then I could have put a technique primer bridge session in there where I'm doing something really easy like 60%, 65% for 3 sets of 3 to 6 and just kind of get my groove without actually creating much fatigue. This is what lifters who are benching 4, 5, 6 days a week are doing. Many of those sessions are primarily there just for helping them get in the groove. You can use this on squat or deadlift as well by going up to 3 days per week and implementing a really easy primer session as well, but this is a lot less common than adding a 4th bench day. You can also manipulate how much you're doing within a session in order to drive a stronger stimulus to hopefully bridge that gap if you have a longer rest period. For example, if you rest 2 days in between bench sessions, but you're only benching 3 sets on the first day, and it doesn't feel like it's enough stimulus to carry over into the next day, maybe up those 3 sets to 5 sets, and that stimulus is big enough to cover that 2-day gap and make you feel properly stimulated coming into the next session. Next, we've got the bleed over between squat and deadlift, and for some bigger lifters, squat will carry over into their bench press, but it's usually pretty rare. In terms of squat and deadlift, there's a few different archetypes that I see in lifters. Some lifters have great work capacity within a single session, and then they get really sore the next day. This might manifest itself as you can squat, and the same day you can deadlift, and deadlift still performs really well. And if that's the case, then that's what you should do. If that same lifter, though, were to try and do squat, and the next day deadlift, they're really sore, their deadlift would get tanked. For other lifters, both of these are going to perform poorly, and we're going to actually have to space the squat and the deadlift apart within the week. Common setup that I might use for a lifter like that might look like primary squat on one day and secondary deadlift on the same day. Then we've got a rest day, and then we've got our secondary squat, another rest day, and then we've got our primary deadlift spaced really far apart from that primary squat. As a rough rule of thumb, whichever lift you have worse leverages for is usually going to be the lift that's more fatiguing and tends to negatively impact the other lift if you try and do it the following day or later within the same session. So for myself, I'm well leveraged for deadlift and I'm poorly leveraged for squat. If I try and squat the day before or the same day as deadlifts, my deadlifts will feel much worse. But if I deadlifted the day before squat or even the same session before squat, my squats wouldn't be that impacted by it. This is going to take a little bit of trial and error to figure out exactly how they play out for you and some creativity with how you're going to space them within the week to make sure they're not impacting each other too much. But it is one of the biggest factors that you want to be considering with where to actually place them and make sure you can produce productive training. Because if you're always fatigued and you can't get good sessions in, doesn't matter how hard you train, if you're always capped at, let's say, 85% of your real potential because you're fatigued, you're never going to be able to create an effective stimulus. And lastly, we have in real life considerations. If you work a manual labor job Monday through Friday, and you try and place all of your primaries on Friday when you're the most fit cooked from 5 days in a row working your 12-hour shifts at the ball crushing factory, you're not going to have a good session. Or maybe you're a student and you don't get to eat all day because you've got labs and then you've got to show up fasted. Maybe you're not tired, but you haven't eaten. Or maybe you have exams you've got to study for and your sleep is shit and your session goes poorly because of that. We want to make sure we're accounting for these in real life circumstances when we choose where to place certain sessions within the week. In many cases, this is actually more important than the timing and the bleed over. Now, if your schedule allows for consistent recovery across the weeks, you don't really have high stress days and low stress days, then predictability is something that we want to bias towards. And what I mean by that is making sure that on meet day, we are able to predict how well we'll actually feel. Usually people compete on Saturdays, so if we can place more of our primaries on that Saturday or the Sunday or the Friday as close as possible to that Saturday, it's going to make it easier to peak our lift and make sure that it shows up strong on that day. The higher the frequency of the lift that you're doing, the harder it is to get this predictability to fall on a certain day. So bench press is usually the lift that, if possible, I'm going to try and put it on the day of the week that the lifter is competing. Whereas if you're only deadlifting once a week, let's say, and you currently do it on Fridays, if I were to ask you to do it on Saturday, the difference between resting 5 days in between sessions and resting 6 days in between sessions, or 6 days in between sessions and resting 7 days in between sessions, it's like a 14% difference or 16% difference, something like that. But on bench, if I try and ask you to go from resting 1 day between sessions to 2 days between sessions, it's a 100% increase in the amount of rest that you have, and that comes back to this timing issue. So if we can create predictability on meet day by having more of our primaries, especially if our higher frequency lifts, fall on the same day of the week as our competition, that's definitely preferred, but it is less preferred than having life stress be taken into account so that we can actually create productive training. Productivity of training is more important than predictability. You might be able to predictably perform on a certain day of the week, but if all of your sessions suck and you can just predict that they suck, it doesn't matter. The person who gets stronger over time from productive training is the person who wins, not just the guy who knows what he can actually hit on meet day. Next, we have accessories, which I break into movement options, or mobility is another way to frame that. The redundancy of the movements we're choosing, the volume in terms of sets and reps we're actually doing, and the effort we're putting into them. The effort is going to be dependent on what we're actually trying to get out of the accessory. Now, if we start with movement options, squat, bench, and deadlift only put us in so many different positions. Over time, this leads to compensations and the loss of the ability to move in other ways. For example, on SBD, we are locking our scaps in place, especially on bench, we're pinning them down and back. On squat, down and back. On deadlift, they're at least down. And so typically what we lose in powerlifting is the ability to protract and upwardly elevate our scapula, and in general, just to move the scapula around freely. Many shoulder issues are a result of scaps that can't move properly. So in order to work on that, I have lifters on their back work emphasize a big scapular range of motion. So on pull downs, this doesn't mean stopping right here. It means actually letting the shoulder blades shrug up. In our rows, we're not stopping here. We're letting the shoulder blades pull forward. I'm also a really big fan of single arm back work where we really let those scaps slide up more than we could if we had both arms in play. And the next way that we train the scapula is through overhead pressing movements. For some lifters, these might have great carryover to their bench. For lifters like myself with a wide grip and a high arch, they have almost no carryover to my bench, but I still do them because they strengthen my serratus, which helps to keep my shoulders healthy, and I get that upward rotation of the scapula. Also going to work some of the stabilizing muscles on the backside, such as the lower trap and the rotator cuff. The next movement that I try to put in every powerlifting program is some form of either split squat or B stance RDL. The reason for that is in powerlifting, we're always lifting symmetrically with our hips moving evenly, and we lose the ability to disassociate our hips from one another. This is why many powerlifters over time become less athletic, and we're especially bad at moving side to side. Maybe we have a great broad jump, a great vertical jump, but if you ask us to leap side to side or to sprint, something's gonna go wrong, or we're just gonna suck at it. And by doing a split squat, we get one hip forward, one hip back. Similar thing with a single leg RDL. We're teaching our body how to use one hip at a time again and regain the skill that we've either lost over time from a long period of powerlifting, or if you're new to powerlifting, helps you not lose that quality. Just by including these in the program, a ton of lifters will clear up low back, hip, and knee problems. These can also do a ton to help manage hip shifts, which we talked about that earlier, and ensure that each leg stays equally as strong as the other. Similar to the hips, the shoulders, we also tend to lose the ability to disassociate them from one another. They're always moving at the same time. So by doing a lot of single arm pulling or single arm overhead press is another favorite of mine, can help to train our body to move the shoulders more independently. One arm dumbbell rows are also extremely underrated, where we're pushing with one hand to brace and pulling with the other. Next, we have the range of motion. In powerlifting, we're trying to reduce our range of motion in most cases, which can lead to the loss of the ability to get into deeper ranges of motion. This is why on pressing accessories, for example, like a weighted dip, I'm trying to get as deep as possible, or on a dumbbell press, as deep as possible. On my RDLs, I'm not cutting the range of motion. Maybe in prep, if I really need to focus on my lockout, I might, but for most of my training, I'm going as deep as my range of motion will allow because my squats and my deadlifts are not getting me in that position. On my squatting patterns, I'm trying to stay really upright, drive the knees super far forward, get a deep stretch on my quads. I actually do sissy squats in my program, primarily for keeping my rectus femoris, my hip flexors, nice and stretched out. For me, when those get tight, and for many lifters, it leads to patellar tendonitis and quad tendonitis flares up. Over time, this loss of range of motion can also start leading to struggles with hitting depth or pain at the bottom of any of the three movements. Next, we have our obliques. Again, powerlifting is all forward and backwards. We're working the erectors, we're working the abs. We don't get any work where we're bending side to side or where we're twisting and we lose that ability, which tends to make our spine a little bit more fragile as well. So two things that I try to put in every program is some sort of lateral flexion, like a side bend, and some sort of rotation. Not only does this strengthen our obliques and improve our ability to brace, it makes our spine a little bit less fragile. We're less likely to get hurt in day-to-day life, but our ribs and spine actually become more mobile, often allowing people to arch better on their bench, which that relates to our center of mass and our ribs. I touched on how rotational work and side bending can help improve some rib mobility, but another thing that powerlifting tends to do is when we're squatting, for example, and we've got the bar on our back, in order to maintain balance, we tend to shove our rib cage forward, and on bench, we are shoving our rib cage forward as well, which tends to lead to powerlifters having a lot of extension in this forward shifted center of mass. Doing things where the weight is in front of us, like a goblet squat, that allow us to shift our center of mass backwards can help to undo some of the compensations that occur as a result of this. One of my favorite options is actually doing Zercher style split squats. They address multiple of these issues that I've mentioned at the same time. The reason why the rib cage being able to shift backwards in space is so important is because the scapula sits on the back of the rib cage. If our rib cage is extended and compressed in the back, the scapula is concave and it can't glide very well along the ribs. But if our rib cage is more expanded posteriorly, the scapula can glide better along the backside of the rib cage, which can also help alleviate a lot of shoulder issues. Many shoulder issues are resolved through getting the obliques and the ribs moving more, especially the ribs moving backwards, and getting the scaps to move more on our back work and our shoulder pressing. Next, we have redundancy. There's a balance to be found between targeting our weak muscle groups and leaning into our strengths on SBD. In general, however, I tend to bias towards focusing on the weaknesses rather than leaning into our strengths too much. Let me give you a couple examples. Myself on bench being very chest dominant, I could try and really lean into that, do a ton of chest accessories to build up my chest even more, but that chest dominance will only become more exacerbated. And when I bench, I get very little tricep stimulus out of it, which is why I actually choose to do much more tricep work than chest work in my accessories. I'm checking the box that my bench press isn't. Another great example, when I squat, I push my hips back, I tend to use my posterior chain too much and my quad is not enough. I have a lot more quad accessories in my program than I do posterior chain. So we're to overly focus on my posterior chain, then when I squat and the weight gets heavy, the body's always gonna try and shift to the muscles that are the strongest, and I'm just gonna keep shifting back into those posterior chain muscles more and more and more. But if I make my quad stronger, I'll be able to maintain position a lot better. Redundancy also comes into play with movement options. If we're choosing a lot of accessories that are only hitting the exact same position over and over again, for example, all of our squat accessories are leg press, belt squat, hack squat, things where we're bilateral, we don't have the option to work in something like a split squat, which pushes us in that unilateral position to help improve and get us out of those bad habits. Or not necessarily bad habits, but compensations we develop from powerlifting. The one thing I will say when it comes to specificity and targeting our dominant movers is if you're a lifter who, for example, when they squat is very wide, you use a lot of adductors, but you can't push your squat hard because your adductors get really beat up, you're more likely to have your form break down and lose positioning. The most important muscle for our squat ends up getting completely neglected because we're not pushing our squat hard enough to actually stimulate it well. And because we say it's trained well by squat, we don't hit it with our accessories. It ends up not getting trained at all, yet it's the dominant mover of bringing our squat up. So if you're in a scenario where form is likely to break down on a movement and the movement is very biased towards a specific tissue, you have to make sure you are touching that muscle with your accessories. Next thing I'm gonna go into is volume in terms of sets and reps. Now, I'm gonna make a whole other video breaking down everything you need to know about hypertrophy for powerlifting and hypertrophy in general. But at a high level, the most common mistakes that I see powerlifters making are doing too many sets. The rep count doesn't matter a ton, but if we can bias that towards a little bit lower, the stimulus to fatigue ratio will be better. And they don't push their sets hard enough to actually stimulate meaningful hypertrophy, which is why they end up having to do a greater set count. Our accessories are not like our SBD. We're not doing these to improve the skill of doing the accessory where we do more sub-max sets so we can squeeze in more volume. We will touch on the effort over here and how that plays into what we're actually trying to get out of it. But for the most part, we're usually going for more of a hypertrophy adaptation, which is going to require us to actually push the accessory hard. And when you're pushing hard, you can't do a lot of sets. Now, if we think back to the movement options and the redundancy, the way that I like to program and that I think most powerlifters should program is they should have a lot of variety within their training. If you try and combine lots of variety, many different exercises, you can't do a lot of sets or the total workload you're doing just becomes too high. So the average set count is going to stay lower. I would say the average accessory, you'll need about 2 sets for. If you're less experienced, probably below 400 dots, maybe 450 dots sort of range, you haven't really filled out your frame with a lot of muscle, then maybe more like 3 sets. I would push it up to 4, but usually 3 is going to be the cap for most lifters. And some accessories you may only need 1 set for if it's something like the obliques where we're going for some rotation just to kind of get the spine moving, but it's not really going to do a whole lot to actually get our SBD going up. Most often on compound accessories, it's going to look something like 2 sets, 5 to 8 reps, RP 8 to 9. On isolation, it's going to look something like 2 sets, 6 to 12 reps, RP 9 to 10. But to expand on that more, let's dive into the effort. The actual amount of effort you're putting into a certain exercise, how hard you're pushing it, how heavy you're loading it, depends on one of 3 categories that I tend to break exercises into. One is you're performing them primarily for the health benefits. So this might be something like the oblique exercise I mentioned, where if all we're really trying to get out of it is making sure we're getting our spine moving and our ribs moving, and it's not actually going to build our total, we don't have to push it hard to get that benefit. We just need to put ourselves in a position. Now, if you have the recovery to push it hard, it's a good thing to just build more tissue and make more muscles stronger. But as you get more advanced, you have to pick and choose what things you're actually going to push and where you're going to pull back. Myself, for example, on split squats, they are absolutely essential for my hips to feel healthy. However, I can't recover from pushing my squats, my split squats, and all of my other leg accessories at the same time. So I do a couple sets of sub-max split squats just to get my hips in that position and help me to stay loose. Next category would be strength. These would be accessories that are similar to our SBD movements. It's going to look like things like a hack squat, maybe a leg press, a weighted dip or a dumbbell press, an RDL or a stiff leg deadlift. These are things that have much more direct carryover to our SBD. These things are going to be programmed closer to SBD in the fact that we'll usually have a more consistent ramp up across the block. However, not as drastic as the SBD. An example RP might be RP7, RP8, RP9, RP9. Or maybe if we're doing a back end deload, RP7, RP8, RP9, drop back to RP7 on week 4 again. If you're a less advanced lifter, maybe this is RP8, RP8, RP9, RP9. Kind of get the idea of what I'm talking about here. A small range, but we want to make sure we do have room to progress movement across the block. Typically are more fatiguing, which is why we don't want to push them to failure all the time. And then lastly, we're going to have hypertrophy focused accessories. Maybe things like our pull downs, our rows, our chest flies, our push downs, our leg extensions, things that we're not getting a direct strength carryover stimulus to our SBD, but they are adding size to our frame. These are things that we should be pushing with near max intent. Example RP might just be at 9, at 10, at 10, at 10 for an isolation exercise, and for maybe your back work, maybe at 8 on the deload week, and then at 9, at 9, at 9 for the entire rest of the block. The rep count will change a little bit more here as well. If something is done more for health and we're not pushing the RPE, often I'm gonna give myself more reps just to get more time and more total exposure into that position I'm trying to improve. So on my split squats, for example, even though they're a compound accessory, I'm usually going to be pushing those for sets of like 10 to 15 because I'm keeping them so light. If something is strength focused, this is going to depend on what sort of rep range you respond to best, which goes back to the other segments we talked about in the video. And as for hypertrophy, I already mentioned a couple examples, but generally anything between like 5 reps and 20 reps is going to be really productive for powerlifting, but the most productive is usually going to be in that 6 to 10 range. Another thing you do want to consider when choosing where to place certain accessories is the bleed over in terms of fatigue that they'll have into your SBD. If something is a more stretch biased exercise, it's going to create more muscle soreness, which is more likely to bleed over into our SBD. So something like a stiff leg deadlift, we want to be careful about placing that in the session before our primary deadlifts because that hamstring, glute adductor, low back fatigue is more likely to negatively impact that session. So therefore, it might make more sense to place those on the same day as your primary deadlifts. But again, it comes down to what you feel strongest with, but make sure you're considering the resistance profile of the exercise, as if we are focusing on the range of motion, getting a really deep stretch, it is more prone to making us sore. And then if you have a certain exercise where it's like, I know this exercise is something I should be doing, but I just can't recover from very much volume, Don't be afraid to do one set of something. One set goes a lot farther than zero. The final segment we're gonna dive into for this video is long-term planning. This is planning over the course of at least 3 months, maybe 6 months, up to a whole year. Not just what we're doing within a single week or within a single block, but how we're stringing multiple blocks together. The 3 main components I'm gonna be touching on are off-season versus prep, as well as momentum in maintaining our progression from block to block. Because momentum is a quicker subject, we're probably gonna dive into that first. So similar to choosing the weights we're gonna hit over the course of a block, being careful not to blow our load on that week 3, ensuring we have room to continue to go up in load every week, we wanna make sure we leave ourselves room to go up in load from block to block, assuming we're not resetting from singles back to a higher rep count, for example. Therefore, if you're hitting RP 10 at the end of your block, let's say RP 10 triple, and next block your program says a double at 9, well, on paper, a double at 9 is the same load as a triple at 10. So you have to get stronger, otherwise you're going to be repeating the same load for fewer reps, which psychologically tends to mess with most lifters if they're not seeing that consistent progression. So you have to make sure when you're picking your end of block goals, you're choosing a load that leaves room for a little bit more weight on the bar to keep adding load. And when you come back around to triples, so you hit your triple at RP 9, even if training went terribly, you can simply push it to a 9.5 or a 10, and you will be able to squeeze out a PR. Stacking those wins over and over and over again, even if your estimated 1 rep max doesn't change, is often what keeps you motivated long-term to keep putting in the work that's going to allow your training to keep driving better results. And at the end of the day, it's those years of training stacked together that make you stronger. But years are comprised of blocks. Now, when it comes to planning out those blocks, whether it be off-season or prep, the biggest thing that changes is not the overall setup of our week, but rather where we are placing our focus. In the off season, the number one priority is finding out all of the information we've touched on here and figuring out what the best setup for you is. So if you haven't figured out your ideal frequency, how many back down sets you should be doing, what kind of rep ranges you respond to best, you haven't figured out any of that stuff, you need to be experimenting to figure that out. That is the number one purpose of the off season, is figure out what works. Once you know what works, you can run that basic structure and then you change what you're actually pushing. During prep, you're typically gonna be pushing your top sets a little bit harder, your back downs are more sub-max, accessories more sub-max. Whereas in the off season, you're probably gonna be pushing the back downs a little bit more. Maybe you're gonna be pushing a little bit more variations and you're gonna be pushing those accessories a little bit more. This is what's gonna help build our base as an athlete, so that when it comes time to peak, we have the muscle mass accrual and the work capacity necessary for actually driving up top end when we're pacing these blocks to hit PRs month after month. A couple examples of things that I like to have lifters do in order to prioritize back downs and accessories more in the off season. One, your top sets on your primary will often become a close variation. Some of my favorite examples are gonna be long pause bench instead of competition bench, pause squats, and pause deadlifts. By switching to another variation, it psychologically gets easier to not be trying to beat your old PRs all the time, accidentally overshooting on your top sets, and then ruining your energy you have for those back downs. If you choose a variation where you've never pushed it before, it's a lot easier to hit a PR because you've never done it before, so you get those psychological wins of, oh, I PR'd my pause squat triple. Even though you've never really done triples, you're still hitting PRs and it feels good, rather than I just hit a squat triple, but I've done way more, so it's not really a PR. Psychology is a really underrated thing in powerlifting these days, and getting those constant wins is a great way to give yourself the psychological boost you need to stick with it. So in addition to not pushing the top set as hard, one of my favorite ways to prioritize the back downs is, let's say your top set at the end of the block was going to be RP 9 if this were prep. Now we're gonna drop that to an 8, and our first back down, we're actually gonna push that one up to a 9. So our first back down essentially becomes like the actual top set. Gives you a new set to focus on trying to PR that's not quite as specific as pushing the real top set. And that way you don't burn through your momentum that you're gonna wanna use during prep. And then the last tool that I'll often use is I will swap out one of the back down sets in favor of an accessory that would fit into that strength category we mentioned in the previous section with the accessories. So we might swap a set of squat over to hack squat or a leg press. We might swap a set of bench over to a flat dumbbell press or a weighted dip. We might swap a set of deadlifts over to a set of stiff leg deadlifts, something that's going to build more of our general strength rather than our specific strength. The last thing that I'll sometimes do is, in an effort to increase the work capacity of the lifter, we actually will just add the set to the accessories. We won't cut a set out of the back downs, and we'll see how the lifter can recover. If the lifter can recover from this, then it is preferred to bring up our work capacity more, and then we can simply cut that additional set back out when we're ready to prep. And now when we're doing the workload we were previously doing, we have better recovery capacity and it's easier to maintain. And then during prep, some of what we'll do related to that is we'll cut out some of the fluff. If you increased your accessory volume in the off season to the point where it did slow down progress, then cutting it back to the level that allows you to progress quicker again is something we're gonna wanna do. However, if you added that additional set to accessories, some lifters will actually find they just started progressing faster, in which case you should keep doing that. This is especially common with more beginner lifters, sub 400 dots sort of range. But another area where you can save some additional recovery during prep is by cutting back your set count or your RPs and some of the muscles that aren't directly increasing your SBD. So this might mean our lat pull downs, our rows, our biceps, our side delts, our core, our calves if you're training that. Maybe we drop those from 3 sets down to 2, or maybe instead of hitting RP 9 or 10, we're hitting RP 8 or 9. And that allows just a little bit more CNS recovery to focus on our SBD a little bit harder during prep. Most often, the way that I'm actually implementing this is on the final block of prep, then I'll cut back a little bit for most lifters because adding that tissue is just such a slow process that we don't want to cut back on it multiple months out of the year if we don't have to. Now, I know all this is probably a little bit overwhelming, so I did include a free program in the caption as well. It's an intermediate program, but you can actually take some of the things I talk about in this video and apply it to that program to further customize it to your needs. The program is set up to be a template, so there is a lot of room to adjust it already by choosing variations. The set counts have ranges, the rep counts have ranges. Most of the accessories have drop-down tabs for you to choose from, so it's a really good base for you to start with. I've got a couple other free things in the caption, so make sure you look at those. And I also have the link to my coaching application down there as well, in case you don't want to try to figure out all of this for yourself. I will say you can expect a faster response time from me if you just DM me on Instagram rather than filling out the application, but I should reach out within a day or two if you do hit the application button below. And lastly, make sure to subscribe because I should be dropping a few more videos similar to this one that are very in-depth on how you can become a better powerlifter or better powerlifting coach. And if you are a powerlifting coach, I do also offer mentorship, so fill out the application for that below or also shoot me a DM on Instagram.